Hi, Peter, and audience. Thank you for the kind introduction. I hope you can hear me okay, and thank you for the opportunity to speak at Parliament House, and sorry that I could not be there in person. For those of you who don't know me, here is a quick background on what I've been doing in the last 10 years since I left Australia. After finishing my PhD at the University of Sydney, helping to develop an Australian space telescope, I went to work at NASA Ames Research Center in California. There, I helped build Singularity University, which is an institution studying and promoting the understanding of accelerating exponential technologies and their impact on business and the world at large. After that, I helped develop a small lunar lander, which was the cheapest lunar lander by NASA standards, but still staggeringly expensive as a space vehicle. Frustrated with that experience, I also then helped develop a spacecraft based on a smartphone called the NASA Ames PhoneSat. The PhoneSat used a regular smartphone as the flight computer for the spacecraft, and all told cost under $5,000 in parts, yet was a fully functional spacecraft. We launched 3 of those spacecraft into space in 2013. Emboldened by that experience, I left NASA with some friends and co-founded a company called Planet Labs. Planet Labs aims to launch over 100 Earth imaging CubeSats into orbit and image the whole Earth every day at 3-meter resolution. To date, Planet has actually launched over 100 satellites. Interestingly, having been out of Australia now for 10 years and coming back once or twice a year, I have a low resolution understanding of what has changed over Australia. And not being there, the changes 6 months to a year when I come back are quite dramatic. Contrasting to when I finished my PhD, there are now small spacecraft programs in nearly every technical university in Australia. An entire initiative to provide broadband, the NBN, has been conceived and executed in this time. There are also a number of small space startups. Furthermore, there is an increasing amount of VC investment available to tech companies, and some of that also going to space companies. So there are, in addition, there are many other students and professors developing payloads and instruments for space. And of course, facilitated by this CRCSI, an increasing use of geospatial information and services in Australia as well. So there is actually a thriving space industry in Australia at this point. More broadly in the world, we have advanced technologies from mobile phones and other devices that have increased the capability of electronics, yet reduced the cost dramatically. That means that nanosatellites, once considered toys, are now fully capable spacecraft, capable of executing serious commercial, governmental, and scientific missions. There are hundreds of satellites, nanosatellites and small satellites, built by students all around the world, and by amateurs and professionals. A recent study by the Tory Group, released yesterday, said that the venture capital investment in 2015 into the space industry was double what had been put into the industry in the last 15 years. There are now over 50 venture capital firms worldwide investing in space. And there are many companies emerging that are taking on infrastructure projects of the size and scope of the Planet Labs constellation that would previously have been considered nation-building exercises. If measured by the number of satellites launched, Planet Labs is currently the 4th largest space superpower in the world. And when the entire operational constellation is in space, it will be second only to the United States in terms of number of satellites in orbit. This is a really interesting trend that we should understand, because I think that the industry as a whole is radically different than it was in the past. In addition, we have new launch companies. SpaceX has gone from a startup to a thriving operational business, regularly launching satellites into space. And just around the corner, our neighbours in New Zealand, Rocket Lab, are building their own domestic launch capacity. In terms of the Asia-Pacific region, these lowering costs and increasing capability have allowed many other countries to enter space. Thailand has recently launched a spacecraft, South Korea has launched many spacecraft and of course has their own astronaut program, and Singapore just recently launched 6 spacecraft, all addressing strategic concerns relevant to Singapore. As my colleague Jason Held will hopefully mention in his speech to you later today, Australia could potentially be a net exporter of technologies in the Asia-Pacific region, given the interest and demand and thirst for access to space amongst other countries. And it's particularly given our technological capability in Australia. I think this is a worthy goal. When it comes to government, when I was young, we used to, I guess it's a rite of passage to say, well, I want to do space stuff. Maybe if only Australia had a space agency, or why don't we get NASA some more money? But one of the biggest changes in the industry that I've seen now is this idea of personal empowerment, and perhaps this idea that Australia needs a space agency is an obsolete concept. If you have a look at PhoneSat, again, a satellite built from a single phone that is a fully capable spacecraft bus with telemetry, commanding, attitude control, memory, storage, a camera, almost everything that's in a satellite. That can be built for around $5,000 and launched on as a secondary payload on almost any rocket for about $100,000. So, for the price of a modest home mortgage, an individual or family could actually launch their own spacecraft to space. A PhoneSat is kind of like Sputnik, but it has a camera and a significantly faster processor. And it's kind of interesting to think what the world looks like, where the capability of the entire Soviet Union in 1957 to launch Sputnik is now in your own hands. This is really a different world. So based on this, I think that any individual, family, company, non-profit organization or NGO, or even small nation can launch their own spacecraft suited to their own needs for relatively modest cost. So I think Australia does not need a space agency, but what we really need is a thriving space industry. I think this industry comprises of three components. One is education, two is industry involvement and self-starting, and three is investment. So I'll just speak briefly about each of those three. In terms of education, today's students are actually tomorrow's entrepreneurs. When I was a university student, I was lucky enough to receive an industry top-up to my PhD scholarship, enabling me to focus fully on my work and actually fund travel to conferences. So I think sponsoring students, particularly at the graduate level, to undertake studies in space systems and in space applications is hugely valuable. And so I would first of all like to see industry supporting more students and their space endeavors. Secondly, there is an opportunity to collaborate with students in universities to develop payloads and instruments for spacecraft and to help those students build the systems and get them launched, and whilst they are still at university, gain flight experience. This was something that typically took you 10 years at NASA to do, and now almost every student in an Australian university could have launched a payload or instrument into space by the time they graduate. So I'd like to see industry helping co-develop payloads with students and support the educational programs underpinning these efforts. And then one of the best pieces of advice that I got when I was a student was to travel to a conference and helping Australian students cross the barrier of the Great Pacific Ocean to get over to the United States or to Europe or to Russia or to Southeast Asia and visit other spacefaring countries and meet students like themselves will actually help them find their future collaborators, business partners, and inspiration. So helping students travel and get to conferences and providing financial support to do that, I think, is essential to invest in Australia's future space entrepreneurs. In terms of industry, small spacecraft are no longer toys. And I can easily imagine why space was a daunting proposition for an Australian company 10 or 20 years ago when spacecraft cost millions or fractions of $1 billion. These days, however, a fully functional satellite that could undertake a particularly important mission for Australia could be built for a modest amount of money, anywhere between $100,000 and $1 million. So if you need space data for your particular business or for the environmental or societal or industrial application that you're undertaking, you can actually build that spacecraft yourself now. Most of the risk in building a spacecraft has been reduced, and there is worldwide a thriving market for spacecraft components, particularly for nanosatellites. Over the last 5 or 6 years, this industry has matured, and those components are now extremely high capability and very cheap. And so instead of focusing on building a spacecraft, I encourage companies, nonprofits, and other organizations wishing to dip their toes in the water of space to not focus on the spacecraft so much, but develop the payload and instrument that addresses your needs. The rest of the spacecraft that is necessary to get it into space can be purchased from other companies and integrated for fairly low cost. And so by developing our own payloads, Australia can help obtain data that is hugely valuable to this country and to the world. And as right now a large consumer of GIS data, meshing our new data with existing data sets only increases our capability and benefits all of humanity. Thirdly, the third spoke I mentioned was investment. So despite an unprecedented reduction in cost and a massive increase in capability of small spacecraft, space is still a risky endeavor. Launch vehicles do explode. I have lost 2 sets of spacecraft on a rocket explosion. But by building spacecraft small and in large numbers, you can overcome a lot of this risk. And so I would like to see the Australian investment community, or some fraction of it, adopting a slightly higher tolerance for risk and investing in a small number but diversified set of small spacecraft startups and payload developers, instrument developers, and consumers of GIS data. Not all of those startups will succeed, but some of them will, and inevitably 1 or 2 of them will produce something of huge value to the Australian people. So in summary, I'd like to close by just recapping those 3 points. I think that education is vitally important for an empowered and motivated space workforce in the future. I think that the time has come for industry to take the bull by its horns and build our own space capability right here and now. And thirdly, all of this can be supported by a thriving investment community with a higher tolerance for risk. So with that, I'd like to close and thank you very much for your time.
Let's thank Chris.